I got this 1940s diesel furnace out here in my garage. I would never think to get a 1940s diesel furnace myself. The guy before me who lived here is very industrious and liked to repurpose things, and probably somebody was getting rid of it. He's like, no, don't get rid of that. And he brought his truck and he loaded it up and he installed it here. And so I get this house, I buy it, and I don't know how to use one of these things. And at some point, though, I'm working out in the garage and it's cold and there's a furnace and it's supposed to work. And so I did a bunch of internet research. I watched YouTube videos. I did a bunch of trial and error. And eventually I found this complex, multi-step, multifaceted ritual that if I did in exactly the right order, and then I flipped the switch, that diesel furnace would growl up into action and then would belch this big cloud of black smoke and soot that I'm sure is super good for me. But then the glowing warmth of the heat would almost immediately fill the garage and I could work out there. I was very happy. Several times that first winter that I lived here, I would go out and I'd go through my ritual. You do this, you do this. I put my foot here. I bleed the line like this. We flip this switch over here. Poof. And out comes the black smoke and everything works. It's awesome. And yeah, then as the seasons changed, it warmed up and I didn't use it at all during the summer, of course. It gets to be the next winter number 2. And it's cold outside and I got some work to do in the garage. So I'm like, okay, no problem. I remember the ritual that I do to get the black smoke and the warmth and the result that I want. So I go and do the ritual, but it doesn't work. Doesn't fire up at all. Doesn't even turn over. I'm like, wow, this is exactly what I did before. What am I getting wrong? So I go through all the steps. I'm like, well, maybe when I bled the line, I let the get more fizzy. I'll do that a little bit longer. Maybe I waited a little longer when I flipped this switch. And then finally, by some fluke chance, poof, it worked again. Look, I don't even know what I did wrong or right the first time. I have no clue whatsoever, and every time I try to turn that thing on still, I'm just guessing, but I look like a complete clown because I'm doing all of these things with my body, like I'm trying to tune an antenna or something to try to please the furnace so that it will do for me what it has done for me in the past and give me the joy and comfort of its warmth and its black cloud of soot. Likewise, in the Old Testament, it feels like this is pretty much the story of everything from the time of the dedication of Solomon's temple, a little bit after 1000 BC, all the way up to the end of the Old Testament, maybe even on into the New Testament. The presence of God keeps showing up throughout the Old Testament all the way up until the dedication of Solomon's temple. And so God shows up in the Red Sea scene that we were looking at yesterday in Exodus with Moses and all of the Hebrews are trapped against this body of water. There's nowhere to go. They're all going to die. Why did God take them out here? Here comes the most powerful cavalry on earth. And then boom, the cloud of the presence of the Lord shows up and the laws of time and space are complete joke to the presence of the Lord, and he parts the sea and there's fire and lightning. It's just crazy stuff happening, pillars of flame. And then we transition into the scene where the Mosaic covenant is ordained, consecrated in the next chapters that we were looking at yesterday. And here again, the presence of the Lord, this big cloud shows up and the people, they don't know exactly what they did right or what they're doing. It just showed up. And Moses goes up there, he does whatever God says in the cloud, and he comes back down. He's like, all right, everybody, this is what God seems to want. This would seem to be the deal. He's going to be our God. We're going to be his people, and everybody's going to know that he's the one true God, because if we obey him, he's going to bless us in these ways, and if we disobey him, he's going to punish us in these ways. The result will be the same. Everybody's going to know that he's the one true God, that he's our God, and we're his people, but that will happen with blessings or with curses, depending on our behavior. And everybody, as we're going to look at again today, is like, yeah, right on. We affirm that. We're in. But the memo doesn't get handed down to the next generations super well, and there's a lot of not honoring that covenant. Yet, the presence of the Lord is still around. So out in the desert, as the Hebrew people, after they get done receiving the law on Mount Sinai, as we looked at yesterday in the middle of Exodus, this cloud of the Lord will go out in front of them, leading them through the desert at different points in all of this. And then they build a temporary home for God to dwell among them, like a pre-temple, if you will, like a tent version of the temple where God will live with his people. It's called the tabernacle. And when they dedicate that thing, boom, here's the presence of the Lord. All of this black smoke and everything that demonstrates supernaturally that God is there and he dwells among us. And there are other examples as well, but probably the most notable is when David's son, Solomon, builds the temple that God said he would have Solomon build someday. And they dedicate it with these lavish sacrifices. I mean, it demonstrates the unbelievable wealth that these people had gathered at this time. I mean, we're talking just opulence as far as the eye could see at this gigantic temple dedication thing for this gigantic temple with this gigantic footprint. And apparently God was like, yep, that's it. You get it. That was the right ritual. That demonstrated that you understood how this thing works. And I'm going to show up for that. Now, look, my little cute analogy, metaphor, likewise-y thing kind of breaks down here because really the furnace in my garage is not a deity and it doesn't have a mind, and it's not really an issue that it's pleased with my little motions and actions or whatnot. I control it. I dictate to it. It's just hard for me to remember exactly what I did before to make it do the things that I need it to do. The analogy breaks down because no one controls God. He's sovereign over everything that's written all over every page of the Bible. He's in charge of things. But can you blame the Hebrew people if they're looking at this and they're like, okay, last time the presence of the Lord showed up, it was because we honored these laws, we did these sacrifices, we avoided these bad things, we exalted God in these ways, we obeyed him, big picture in terms of this plan, and God's presence and his blessing was with us. Well, that's not entirely them being superstitious. That's kind of what you start to think like when God creates a conditional covenant. And he did. He said, if you do this and you do this and you do this, and some of the details of that covenant are so specific as to be like, if you stand there but not there, and if you sacrifice in this way but not this other way, then I'm going to bless you. And part of that blessing is them having a clear, even physical at times, awareness of his presence, his dwelling among them. So these last few days, we've been at the end of the book of Ezra, right? We're trying to understand why Ezra the priest in the mid-400s BC is so upset upon arriving back in Jerusalem and discovering that the returning Jewish exiles are marrying all these people from neighboring tribes and hill people who have all of these detestable practices baked into what they do. As we look through the Old Testament together, and as we looked yesterday at this Mosaic covenant and a little bit more at it today, what we figure out is that Ezra, a student of history, is saying, you're doing all the wrong things. That isn't what fires up the furnace. That's what keeps the furnace off. Again, the metaphor is a little bit stretched. I totally get that. But what Ezra is seeing is a serious problem. He's looking at stuff and he's going, all right, we had the presence of the Lord at the Red Sea crossing. We had the presence of the Lord at Mount Sinai. We had the presence of the Lord inarguably out wandering around in the desert, even though we were being idiots back then. All of this is like 1200, 1400 BC, so like 800 years before the time of Ezra. We had the presence of the Lord at the dedication of the temple. But then there's a crisis that is recorded in the book of Ezekiel that happens in 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple and takes the Jews away into exile. Ezekiel writes that he sees from Babylon the dazzlingly glorious presence of the Lord get up and leave the temple and move east. Ezekiel wrote that stuff down. That was not going to be very popular because people were very aware of this presence of the Lord thing, and it meant a very big deal to them. It would mean a very big deal to Ezra. So you remember at the beginning of the book of Ezra, remember how the young people at that dedication of the foundation were like, yay, we built a thing. It's the best building that anybody's. It's a great building. But the old people wept and did not celebrate because they had some living memory of the grandeur of the old temple where the physical manifestation of the presence of God had dwelt. Then a few years go by and we get a little further on in Ezra, and you'll recall there's a description of the dedication of the second temple, the rebuilt temple by Zerubbabel, but the stuff that happened at the first dedication of the first temple, or the dedication even of the tabernacle, it doesn't happen. A cloud doesn't show up. You don't get the doesn't happen. It's not an accident that in Ezra's book here, all of that stuff is recorded. He doesn't have to beat you over the head with it and be like, hey, remember the other stuff? It didn't happen here. This is different. So there's ambiguity about where God is. There's ambiguity because of that in terms of understanding where the people are in relationship with God. And now 50, 60 years have gone by since the full dedication of the temple, and Ezra's out here trying to rebuild the people, reconnect them with God. He wants the presence of God back in the lives of his people, and he knows that there's a whole litany of things based on this covenant that we talked about yesterday and today that need to be happening. Like, we got to do this and not that. We got to follow these steps. We got to do these things in this order. And there's a reason for it. And it demonstrates our adherence to, our obedience to, our submission to God. And if we don't do that stuff, it's not going to happen. The presence of God, we'll never know it again the way our ancestors once knew it and the way our ancestors then went on to squander it. And so Ezra's playing a much bigger game than just in the moment and how people's feelings are right in that second. He's working, again, with the whole big picture narrative of everything. And he arrives in Jerusalem. He's like, are you kidding me? We're not even close to having this right. We're going in the exact opposite direction. And so Ezra's heartbroken over this. He's overwhelmed by the size of the task because as the elite of elite priest of this time in history, as the priestly leader of the people, in a way playing the role of almost a new Moses at this time, it's his job, both commissioned by the king and really in a way by even God himself, to see if he can put back together this relationship between God and his chosen people per the terms of this long since heavily violated on their part covenant made between God and his chosen people through Moses. So it's really important to understand that Ezra is not just some prude who doesn't like the way things are going and thinks these young people are acting like idiots and things used to be better before. He's much different than that. This is not just another generational divide. He's got a big role to play, and it seems like things are kind of stacked against him. With that in mind, we can now move forward in finishing up the book of Ezra and quickly roll over into the book of Nehemiah, which is an extension of the exact same stuff. Hey, last thing, just on a personal note, my kids are all into square dancing. I don't know what happened. I'm not into square dancing. I mean, I liked it in elementary school when we did square dancing, but they like square dancing. That's just something they do. All their little friends, they get together a few times a week. They're like, it's a square dance. I am not going to discourage that stuff. You all can stay out super late, square dance all you want. And so they didn't have somewhere to square dance the other day. So they came in, they cleaned up the garage, and I had to do all the little rituals, and I got the furnace to fire up for the first time in maybe a year. I cleaned up all the black soot, and it was so toasty warm there. It was like 10 below zero outside, and all these kids are in there square dancing in my nice, warm garage. Thanks, 1940s diesel furnace. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.